Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. I'm very excited about this. I know I say this for every episode, but I really am because we've discovered Masonic songs. If you search for Freemasonry songs on Google, you're going to get some pretty interesting results. We're lucky to have a special guest on this week, Worshipful Brother Nathan St. Pierre, who's from the Lodge of Nine Muses, number 1776 here in Washington, D.C., joins us to talk about how there was a time when music had a much larger role in Freemasonry, especially in our degrees, and of course, the unique research work that he's done to uncover some of this history. So let's just start with that main point there. I think a lot of guys listening to this podcast are going to sit here and go, wait, we used to sing songs in lodges?
Oh yeah. Oh, the lodges were singing so many songs that it was getting published in the actual London newspapers, parodies of the Masonic songs, making fun of the Freemasons for being too loud when they were having their meetings up. Absolutely part and parcel of the same thing.
Here's the part that I found interesting. And throughout this podcast episode, we're going to share some examples of songs that you have found and recorded. So you'll hear singing and we'll break from time to time. So guys can get an idea of this, but we're not talking about singing the Star Spangled Banner, which is featured in some of the degree work in some jurisdictions. We're actually talking about songs that have to deal with Freemasonry. So who wrote these songs and where did they go?
So what's really funny is you mentioning the Star Spangled Banner, because the Star Spangled Banner actually is part of this same songwriting tradition that creates these Masonic songs, because the melody for the Star Spangled Banner comes from another song called To Anacreon in Heaven, which was the sort of big festival, here's how awesome we are. Really, it was a drinking song for the Anacreontic Society in England, and this there's a style of songwriting, or I shouldn't say style, I should say a practice of songwriting. That's a Latin word called contrafacta, and we all know what this is. Many of our elementary teachers, though, called them piggyback songs, right? It's where I'm going to take the melody for this one thing and I'm going to change the words, and then it's going to become this other thing. And it's very familiar to people because, or maybe people don't even realize that Baba Black Sheep, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and the Alphabet Song all are the same melody, and that melody is Mozart, and that doesn't matter. That's not important. What is important is it was considered creative. It was considered moving something forward, to take a tune that everybody knew, add your own spin on it, add your own flavor, and then communicate that. Because what sometimes happened, and it actually sometimes happens now, is the sort of superimposed lyrics become more associated with that melody than even the original ones were. So the singing of the Star Spangled Banner, just to kind of swing all the way back, is part of that same tradition, because we have a national anthem that is a piece of contrafacta, because Francis Scott Key took the melody for To Anacreon in Heaven. He wrote his poem, right, in multiple verses at the Fort McHenry, right? And so it is continuing that practice of contrafacta. And in fact, it was so very common in my book chapter that I wrote on this. I talk about, there's a letter from Benjamin Franklin to his brother, where his brother had written a song, and Ben Franklin said, it's a shame that you wrote your own melody, because if you had just taken that very clever you had and to some other thing, then people might actually be singing your song. And it's, so by contemporary standards, we think that's very silly, because we don't want the same thing, old hat. We want something new, come up with. But at that time, it was about taking the familiar and adding your own to it. In a way, music was a meme. And in fact, music is a meme. I do think that, and I use that in the Richard Dawkins way of a thought virus, right? So an internet meme that passes around is sort of the same way. It becomes funny because you're familiar with what it's referencing. So when you add your own sort of sprinkles to it, it sticks better, because you're like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. And what's interesting is upon further digging, because one of these, I think I shared it with you in the ones that we can sample. When to this confusion no end soon appeared, the sovereign Grand Master's word sudden was heard. Then teemed Mother Chaos with maternal throes, and so the Grand Lodge of this world arose. Derry down, 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 derry down. Then heaven and earth with jubilee rung, and all the creation of masonry sung. But lo, to adorn and complete the gay ball, old Adam was made the Grand Master of all. Derry down, 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 derry down. Turns out that that's a very, very old English refrain that used to signal to the listener that what you're listening to is meant to be taken very tongue-in-cheek. And so so it's an example of, so if Masons are taking that melody and then they're writing a song, a text over it, there's that hidden layer of, oh, and when they hear this, they're going to think, X, Y, or Z. In the same way that if you and I were to right now, write a song about the New York Yankees and do it to the tune of Baby Shark, we might be playing on various baseball because Baby Shark's kind of associated with the Nationals, and so there could be a narrative underneath of what's really happening. Meanwhile, at the surface, it's just, oh, they're just singing about the Nationals to the tune of Baby Shark.
It's so interesting that that was the common practice then, because we know that's how a lot of our ritual was written. They literally took parts out of the Bible or Shakespeare, for example, and just threw it in there. They didn't have to source or cite things like we do today. It was just very, as you said, a common practice. And I think nowadays, I think young people, we'd go, oh, we call that sampling, where they take an old song from the 80s and hip hop. Now it's now the backbeat for a big hit or a remix of some sort.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Who were the men that were writing these songs, and what was their inspiration?
So the men who were writing these songs were the George Clooney's of the day. They were the actors at the Drury Lane Theater, at the Theater National, right there. There's extensive documentation that many of the famous ballad opera performers of the day were also members of the Masonic lodges that were meeting near the theater district. And in fact, in 1730, there was a ballad opera that was quite successful, written by a Freemason called The Generous Freemason, that enjoyed some popularity in the theater scene of England at the time. And so what's very interesting about the history of Masonic song is that it's intimately tied to the history of the English theater. And so much so that these citations are in Grove's Dictionary of English Musicians and things like that. These are just well documented connections between Masonic lodges and the theater performers. And the earliest Masonic song that we have that we can still sing, because the melody is still available to us, is the Entered Apprentices song, which was written by Matthew Birkhead. And when Matthew Birkhead died, it's documented that 6 of his pallbearers were Masons who were actors in the theater, because it was just so much a part of. And just to give the listeners an idea of what time period we're talking about here, we are talking about from about 1720 all the way up until about 1730. The idea is that we're talking about sort of the beginning of what we understand as Grand Lodge Masonry in England. And these songs, the practices of singing songs, wasn't unique to England. So we have Irish songs from the same time. We have Welsh songs from the same time. And in fact, some of the most awesome, if you're into the mystic aspects of Freemasonry, the esoteric stuff, the stuff that we don't have to superimpose alchemy on top of it because it's already there and wonderful. Those types of things are coming out of Wales in the early 1730s. There's this awesome book called the Book M that's filled with all these Masonic songs. And very recently, I was able to sort of triangulate that those songs came to the mainland through an architect named Brother Oakley. And so here's this Welsh brother who's literally just, going on a boat across to go see Masons in London. And he comes to London, he hears them singing, and he goes, "Hey, you know what? We sing in Wales too. Sing you a bunch of songs." And he did, because all of a sudden in 1740s, these Welsh songs are now being published in. Singing was Masonic culture. It was part of it.
Our ancient brethren, we know they used to meet in taverns. So that makes sense that, other people in the bar, they would have heard the guys downstairs talking, singing. Well, when would they break into song during the meetings? Or was this something they would do afterwards at the bar, or when they were just celebrating and just having a moment of brotherhood?
Andrew Pink, he's one who's written quite a bit for the Grand Lodge of England, and Andreas Onefors, he's also written about this. And both of these brothers and scholars have come up with some taxonomies that I like, in terms of like, when we look at this, and we're talking about hundreds of Masonic songs, most of them are going to be for formal convivial use. That's essentially the festive word, which very much was considered part of the meeting to those brethren, right? But Brother Warner has identified 4 categories: functional, which provides entertainment. So this is where you get some of those ones that I was alluding to earlier, where maybe like it's tongue in cheek to make people, laugh and, whatever. So yes, it's a Masonic song. Yes, there's secret or mystery to it or what have you. But yes, it is a part of us. So we've got a lot of songs from that time about just how Masons are great. Other people, they're just dumb. Why don't other people understand how great Masons are? But they print Masonic virtues. So the reason we're so awesome isn't because we joined the club. That's not why. The reason why is because we're Masons. And because we're Masons, it means we are X, Y, and Z. So this kind of goes back to where I was joking with you a month ago, where I said, imagine if Masons believed the words they said, right? Because that's what's happening here. Is you have a song where we're edifying our virtues, and we're talking about how awesome, how great an institution Masonry is, to be brother to a king, right? And all of these sorts of things. It's because they're saying we're Masons, because we actually believe that Masons are these these virtues that we talk about in our rituals. We believe it. And then the final category is externally demarcating. So that's essentially othering that happens to the Masons within London society at the time, right? Where we don't understand the Masons, we don't get what's going on there. So they get sort of, othered. And so to counter the othering that was happening, they created a bunch of songs that talked about like, oh, well, the reason why those people don't like us is because those people don't get it. Let them laugh because they're dumb.
Some folks have with curious impertinence strove from Freemasons' bosoms their secrets to move. I'll tell why in vain their endeavors must prove, which nobody can deny, which nobody can deny. Of that happy secret when we are possessed, our tongues can't explain what is lodged in our breasts. The blessing so great it can ne'er be expressed, which nobody can deny, which nobody can deny.
I'm enjoying this. It's the music of Freemasons, Masonic songs, and we have a very talented guest who's lent his voice, and you're hearing some of his music throughout this podcast episode. Worshipful Brother Nathan St. Pierre of the Lodge of the Nine Muses here in Washington, D.C. Here's what I find interesting about this. You had mentioned that Masonic music was a big part after the Grand Lodge era, which would have been after 1717 in England. And that's when a lot of our ritual was beginning to be codified, literally through the monitors that were being published and shared in the exposés, and all the lodges were basically copying what now we would know as the lectures that were part of it. How is it that music didn't get inserted into degrees or some of our ritual that's practiced?
Oh, but it absolutely did. I mean, the early constitutions that we have that are dictating like the history of masonry, it's always talking about. So we all know about Tubal Cain and that sort of. But Tubal Cain comes from a family that also has Jubal, and Jubal does music, and Tubal Cain does metal. And the idea is, in all of the books that are written that track what we call the traditional history, it's always saying that what happened was, this is skill, this is masonry. Masonry and skill are very similar because it all comes from Adam being the perfect creation from God. And then and Anderson says, and was created with geometry imprinted on his heart. So essentially, like from the creation, masonry has existed.
Hmm.
And so then from Adam, it passes through a succession of ages unimpaired, right? So on and so forth too. Here we are now chatting over the internet, like, and how cool this is, but we're talking about the same thing. And so the fact that that Jubal is listed as creating music, so they inscribe that on pillars, one that can withstand flood and one that can withstand fire, which may be similar to some other things that Masons in monitored texts have heard. But so they inscribe that, and then the flood happens. And then after the flood, that those pillars get found. So that's how this all passes down, so on and so forth. Now, some histories go down to Africa and include Hermes Trismegistus. Some go to Greece, and that's how we can get things like, the great Pythagoras was a Mason, right? And it's because we're not saying like so and so was initiated into a lodge of free and accepted Masons of the Grand Lodge of Nebraska or whatever. Like, we're saying that they're part of a mystery tradition that we acknowledge as masonry because it comes from the creator. And so what the early Masons were calling this was the art divine.
Guardian genius of our art divine, unto thy faithful sons appear. Cease now, ruins of these to pine, and smile on blooming, and smile on blooming beauties here.
That's where the craft comes from. It was or the divine science, and that sort of thing. So this idea that we as Masons can participate in the act of creation, that was divinity itself. So as long as we are acknowledging this tradition, we're participating in the ancient and gentle craft, the art divine, that which is. And to the extent that we ignore that, and we think, oh, we just have secret handshakes and we're in a boys club who has dinner together and sometimes smoke cigars. If that's happening, the early Masons would have called them false brethren, and they actually wrote quite a bit about these false brethren, or the knife and forkers, and how they weren't actually even like considered part of the fraternity, even though they were initiated. But we're a lot more cosmopolitan now, I like to think.
To that point, earlier this year with Brother Angel Millar, we were able to travel back in time. He did a guided meditation, and we did a trip back to an 18th century lodge in England that was going through the Egyptian rite, so to speak. And that was really neat to, in your mind, to envision what it would have sounded like or felt like. And I can only imagine what it must have felt like for a brother to go to a lodge meeting then versus what it's like going to a lodge meeting now. And I'm not beating up modern Freemasonry because, things change and they evolve over time, but there seemed to be a lot more focus on the brotherhood aspect of Freemasonry, and music would you say, was kind of a working tool that was able to bring the brothers together that way?
What we say is harmony is the strength and support of all well-regulated institutions, especially this of ours. And that's monitored text, and we can say that, right? And it's because they really are driving into a very fundamental principle, and it goes back to Pythagoras, where Pythagoras, as the legend goes, on his anvils, and he noticed, oh, this one is twice as big as this one, and it makes a tone that's exactly one octave higher. Oh, let me see if I can, further this experiment. And then we get the monochord, and then we get blah, 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 and we get Pythagorean ratio. Music was math. Like, he didn't see them as different. Like, Pythagoras was, like, he is our ancient friend and brother. Like, he saw music as the language of creation. And to go come back to Kirk McNulty, when he talks about the 7 liberal arts and sciences, he talks about as a progression, like as a winding staircase where you cannot, and he in fact rearranges the order. You need grammar to get to rhetoric, because you need to learn words before you can argue with them. And then once you can say something, then now I'm going to persuade you. Now I have drama, so now I have rhetoric, right? And so in the same way, you start with mathematics, and then geometry is math in space, and then when we get to music, that's math in time, and then when we get to astronomy, that's math in space. So everything is built on the first one. And so that's why actually music is right up there with astronomy. And so kind of fun is in the 1600s, Johannes Kepler, he did some math out, because he was a big Pythagoras guy, and he was like, I think Pythagoras was onto something with these ratios. And he did some math out, and he found that the orbits of matched Pythagoras's intervals like pretty closely, right? Because Pythagoras took that one step further and said, well, if there's harmony on earth, there must be harmony in heaven. So that's where we get the idea of the harmony of the spheres, okay? So the harmony of the spheres was an actual philosophy or belief that, in the same way that when you move something on earth, it makes sound, because sound is simply vibration. Well, since the moving, they must be making a sound. Well, we can't hear the sound that they make because it's so big. So what sound is it? Well, it must be similar to the sounds that we hear on Earth, because the math is what the math is. Now, I should point out that Kepler was later proven wrong, but it still, is worth pointing out that here's an astronomer, right? That's the top of our ladder of the sciences, right? But he's building on the idea of Pythagoras, who was speaking from music.
I love this. This is like getting taken to school. And I like the point that you made. I was a very successful D in math student for most of my junior high and high school career, but also was in band. And that point was brought to me like, how are you struggling in math when you play a musical instrument, don't you? And I'm like, oh, okay. Never really.
Brother Michael, I got to tell you, so I have a PhD in music. Okay. I got a D in math, and I tell my students now, I say D is for diploma. And I got the same thing that you did, because everyone was like, oh, well, there's a math and music connection, and I always just kept my mouth shut and said no. Because but we got to remember that Pythagoras is talking about music as like sort of the Platonic ideal of music, not like, hey, I'm going to put on Whitney Houston, I want to dance with somebody, because God darn it, I'll get up every single time. Like, that's not where he's going with that. He's talking about, music with a capital M, so to speak. If I can sort of rescue our brother there.
Once I was blind and could not see, and all was dark around. But Providence did pity me, and soon a friend I found. Through secret paths my friend me led, such paths as babblers never tread. With a fa-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la. All stumbling blocks he took away, that I might walk secure, and brought me along ere break of day to wisdom's temple door, where there we both admittance found to mystic paths on hallowed ground. With a fa-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la.
Well, the other point that you had made, and I want to kind of backpedal to that as well and revisit it, is you talked about tradition with a capital T. What did you mean by that?
So there's an author, Hobsbawm, who was writing in I believe the 80s, and he wrote a book called The Invention of Tradition. And essentially he kind of took a sort of sarcastic look at tradition, meaning like with a capital T. And his main argument was, if you look deep enough, every tradition is invented at some point for the purpose of increasing the importance by drawing it further back in time. Like if we can say, oh, we've always done this, it gives it a more strength than just, oh, we're going to start doing this now. Lie. What his point is eventually, if you go back far enough, you will find that somebody somewhere said, all right, we're going to do this now. Now, what's interesting, I bring up Hobsbawm because the first example that he provides in his book is the Freemasons. And it's just perfect. When I talk about the tradition with a capital T, I'm talking about what was the mythopoeic history, the traditional history that all Masons in the early Grand Lodge era, and these are Masons that are coming out of, as we know, commingling with the actual Masons who for 100 years before that had their Mason's word and their things, right? There's this commingling happening in the early 1700s, and it's a very interesting time politically for England. Like there's just a lot going on, but all of these guys all put in writing and distributed throughout the British Isles that Adam was created by God with geometry imprinted on his heart. That is as bread and butter as in the beginning God created. Like that was, that's part of their world. So much so that in 1756, when Lawrence Dermot pushes the Ahimon Raison, which is sort of like the ancients' version of Anderson's constitutions, his history, or pardon me, his history is prefaced with the greatest story of the dog ate my homework ever, because he's making fun of Anderson, because Anderson says, in the beginning, God created Adam, and by creating Adam, God created Masonry. So Lawrence Dermot's going to say, like, fine, I'm going to show you that Masonry actually predates the creation. Here's how. Oh, no. My dog just got onto my desk and just ran away with this document that I just spent writing. Oh, and on top of that, I should mention that it was dictated to me by an angel in my sleep, and all of these things, like, and so on and so forth. And it's tongue in cheek. But then ultimately, once he starts the history, it's in the beginning, God created Adam with right? So in other words, like, even though like I'm making fun of you for saying, oh, Masonry goes all the way back, literally the moment, that's Masonry. Like, I'm still gonna buy in. Like it's how do you say it? It's professional wrestling. It's kayfabe. Like, yeah, you're like really is broken. I buy it. Like I'm there with you. And so that's why I say tradition with a capital T, is because I mean I think the academic Mason, or the thinking man's Mason, is going to say, no, we probably don't go all the way back to the creation. But at the same time, I, as a Freemason, am going to stand here right in front of you and say, we 100% do. Over the past about 20 years, there's been different waves. We called it traditional observance. We've called it observant Masonry. We've called it, like, there's lots of different terms that come out for this idea of we're going to look to the past to look to the future, right? Well, what happened was a lot of great scholarship happened, and a lot of brothers, younger Masons, were getting interested. But one of the downsides was, in the absence of people really reading what happened, like what's early Masonry, what is there, we just sort of kind of created our own thing. Like, oh, well, traditional observance means I'm going to wear a tuxedo. Traditional observance means we have dinner afterwards. Traditional observance means we smoke cigars. Traditional observance means there's whiskey. Like, traditional observance means, and all of those things were not like, it left a bad taste actually in a lot of people's mouths, and it created like TO. There was a time when it was almost like, oh, we don't want to talk about that because those people are whatever. My take on it is, traditional observance has nothing to do with the activities that the lodge does beyond that. Traditional observance means you observe that there is a tradition. You observe that we're coming from this thing that once upon a time people felt so strongly about that they said this goes all the way back to the maker.
Mm.
And so, as long as, and that's again my soundbite of imagine if Masons believed what they said. And in Anderson's Constitution, 1723, the first document to be sponsored by a Grand Lodge included 4 Masonic songs, one of which was a musical setting of the traditional history. Adam, the first of humankind. And that is one of the MP3s that you have.
Adam, the first of humankind, created with geometry, imprinted on his royal mind, instructed soon his progeny, Cain and Seth, who then improved the liberal science in the art of architecture, which they loved, and to their offspring did impart.
Because it really did start with Adam and go all the way to King George. And here we are now. But this is one of the first ones that we get, and it's a mainstay for like a very long time. That's what I mean by tradition with a capital T, is we're saying that by participating in this thing of Freemasonry, we're participating fully in it. And that means that in the kayfabe world of Freemasonry or wrestling or however you have it, I believe that when I enter an apprentice, pass a craft, or raise a master, that I am doing as has been done unto me. That's, I guess, my very long-winded answer to your question about imagining when you go into a space, like what must it have been like to go to lodge back then, is I've recently really started to get excited about the idea of imagining that it's what it's like now.
I'm trying to turn that corner, and I want to stay positive with, modern Freemasonry, because we definitely, have a whole bunch of new issues that have now entered modern men, and it's made its way to the craft.
Yes.
I think a simple thing would be is, we could just start singing at our festive boards.
Amen. Yes.
In between the toasts, and just start bringing back some of that big T tradition.
That's it. Yes, because, and there's science on this. The most exciting times happen when we sing together, and like every part of the brain lights up and whatever. And there's so much science. And this is why, like, one of my favorite things about, I love to go to concerts. Like rock shows, and I just love live performance. One of my favorite things is when they'll do impromptu a cappella, make the crowd sing Bohemian Rhapsody at the top of their lungs just because they can. And because it's one of these transcendent experiences where you're like, I'm part of 30,000 people and they're all doing the same thing together. So yes, 100%, get our 8, 9, 10, 50 guys and have them all sing the Robert Burns Adieu at the end of every meeting, doing something that hasn't been done in almost 200 years, right? And that's the coolest thing.
So music never really left Freemasonry. It never really left the craft. It's just,
yes, Freemasons left music. That's it. Yeah.
I love that you advocate for that.
In fairness, and around the 1830s, it starts to sort of come back. But because Masonry was dealing with a lot of other things at that time, you got the Morgan affair, you got the anti-Masonic party, you're talking about the United States here. You've got a public opinion around Masonry that's shifting. Okay. So Masonic song didn't go away, but the content changed dramatically and became a lot more about the fraternal aspect of Masonry. Like, so-and-so is good because so-and-so is a brother and we're all together and we're having a good time, and and that sort of thing, which is wonderful. Brotherly love is one of the principal tenets of our order, but it was at the sacrifice of the things that may have raised a curious eye in terms of like, oh, I'm singing about, how Noah was a Mason.
You people who laugh at Masons, draw near, attend to my ballad without any sneer. And if you'll have patience, you soon shall see what a fine art is Masonry. There's none but an atheist can ever deny, but that this great art came first from on high, since God himself I'll prove for to be the first great master of Masonry.
But then as we move into antebellum and then into the 20th century, it changes, and that's when you get Pleyel's hymn and those things that come into the lodge. So it's almost like playing to this idea of those people who would have been initiated at that time would have remembered a time when we sang. And so a lot of times you get texts that are in the mid 1800s to the 20th century, you get texts based on hymn tunes, which is also fine. But that's, I think, don't quote me on this, but I imagine that's where the idea of the lodge organist would come from.
Well, let's talk about, I think one of the important takeaways I always have in the third degree is when we talk about the master's word and that it's lost and it's up for future generations to find it. And it kind of plants that seed in our head that, we're here on this level of time, yada, 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 and that we really need to start preserving the craft for those future generations. You mentioned a couple other brothers that have done research or work into this space. Who's out there preserving these songs and keeping this history intact so that future brothers can be singing these songs?
There's another brother, because he's also a college fraternity brother of mine in Phi Mu Alpha Symphonia music fraternity, and he's done some good work on songs in fraternal societies. He talks about Masons because he's a Mason, but then there's Andrew Pink in England and Andreas Arnefors. This scholarship has existed. I think it really did just fall out of practice. And so I have been working since about 2017 to bring it back. There are some exciting things on the horizon. We've been working on a book with the song notation and the text and the historical, some historical notes on when it would have been performed, when it was found, who wrote it, why, if those are details that we know, I like to provide it. And the other thing that I liked to provide was when I found the song, here's where I found it, and here's the year that was published. So here's what they would have had access to, and that sort of thing. So I'll give you an example. If you were to Google, like a Masonic songbook from, say, 1806, you would find a wonderful songbook that would say, like, to the tune of the Old Brown Derby. Well, nobody was born after 1745 knows the Old Brown Derby, right? But enter Worshipful St. Pierre.
When are you looking for this book to be released?
As soon as possible. My dream, I would love it to be released somewhere near a St. John's Day. So whether it's near June or whether it's near December, because one of the richest song music traditions was around the St. John's feast. That's where a lot of songs happened, was singing for the feast days.
Well, I love that you have shared your passion. I know I've gotten a chance to hear you speak and have gotten to meet with you and sit in lodge with you. And I'm so thankful that you took the invitation to join us. Our guest this week on the Craftsman Online podcast, Brother Nathan St. Pierre. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, I was delighted to be here. Thank you, brother.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We are available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.